The envelope was simple and black, the hawthorn crest pressed in wax like an accusation. Amelia Hawthorne had not expected her father to die. She had expected him to keep breathing like a machine. Functional, distant, cold. Death was messy. It left paperwork and wills and small, precise cruelties handed down at a mahogany table. She slit the envelope with a butter knife as if she needed ritual for such moments. The note inside read, in Edward Hawthorne's clinical hand, "You are requested to attend the reading of my will." No explanation, no apology, just an instruction and the faint odor of expensive cologne. 15 years ago she had left this house with her suitcase and a promise never to be beholden to Hawthorne expectations again. Her life had been looser then. A sensible job, a small apartment, dignity folded into the margins. She'd told herself she was fine without their approval. She'd been right, until the letter nudged a bruise she'd thought healed. She returned not because she wanted anything from the house. Edward's furniture smelled of old success, but because leaving had taught her how much power overlooked contempt could yield. He had favored Lucas, golden, reckless, always in the right light, and dismissed Amelia's competence as dangerous cleverness. She had learned to take the measure of people while they measured her as disposable. At the reading, the room felt like a courtroom. The lawyer read the clauses with a voice that treated family as line items. Lucas, handsome and insolent, smiled like he was already king. Margaret, the stepmother, sat with gloves folded, perfect and pale. Edward Hawthorne bequeaths the following, the lawyer said. Lucas Hawthorne inherits Hawthorne Industries. Margaret Hawthorne receives the estates and liquid reserves. Amelia Hawthorne receives control of Edward's secret offshore portfolio, exclusive patents, and a set of international properties, with one firm condition. She must not interfere with Hawthorne Industries or its management for a period of 5 years. Any breach voids her bequest. A murmur slid across the room like a current. Amelia's chest hardened in a way that felt like iron forming. She had been given access to tools Lucas and Margaret had thought belonged to them alone. The condition was theatrical, control without contact, but rules were surfaces. She had learned the levers beneath them. She left the estate with a will in her lap and an old map burned into her memory. The routes people took when they lied, the soft freezes of their eyes, the place's arrogance always exposed itself. She planned nothing in the first hour. She let cold clarity come, slow and patient, like the settling of dust before a storm. If revenge is a firework, Amelia built the fuse. She did not march into the estate swathed in vindication. She retreated to the city and made a list. First, she consolidated what Edward had given her. The offshore portfolio was not a single account but a lattice. Shell companies, dormant patents, trusts, and curiously overlooked intellectual property. She spent days in rooms where light came in through Venetian blinds, and men with bad ties introduced her to men with better ties. She met a lawyer, Daria Katri, who had a conscience calibrated to contracts and an appetite for precision. She met a forensic accountant, Elias Chen, who had the tired, meticulous air of someone who loved balancing impossible books. She took small steps that required patience. Opening accounts in third jurisdictions, registering foundation names that sounded philanthropic, acquiring minimal stakes in businesses that controlled the verticals the Hawthorne empire relied upon. She was careful, surgical. She never bought enough to draw attention. She bought influence. A discreet board seat here, a modest investment there, an advisory contract that put her mind in the rooms she needed. She hired a PR strategist who specialized in reputational risk and a cybersecurity operator who could read corporate leaks like open books. For each person she recruited, she paid in the currency they valued. Equity, future contracts, quiet gratitude. Never cash that could be traced to a headline. When you look at a chessboard, it's the quiet moves at the edges that matter. A pawn to open a line, a bishop set to control a diagonal. Amelia moved at the edges. The first incidents were small and anonymous. A supplier's compliance certificate for one of Lucas's resorts, dated incorrectly. A regulatory filing for a renewable energy project that failed to disclose a minor but disqualifying ownership interest. A rumor slipped to a trade journalist that a Hawthorne-backed startup retained counsel who'd just been censured for ethical lapses. The kind of whispers finance amplifies until rumor acquires the cadence of fact. Lucas responded with the sound of someone surprised by friction. He issued statements confident and brittle. He made public speeches about business as usual. Yet cracks appeared. A partner quietly rewrote a contract. A planned launch postponed. A board member exchanged stiff emails and then asked for independent audits. Amelia never lodged a complaint publicly. She let other people's reactions do the work of accusation. The market smells fear. Money smells like logic. When people in power detect instability, they retreat to safety. Smaller bets, tighter oversight, sudden caution. She harnessed that reflex. She also began to plant allies inside the Hawthorne orbit. A junior analyst at a firm Hawthorne relied on was quietly promoted by one of Amelia's contacts after delivering a memo questioning Lucas's acquisition. A boutique bank's compliance head received an innocuous note, unsigned, that prompted a closer look at a transaction that looked normal on paper but smelled of hurried calculation. Each nudge wasn't an attack. It was a redirection, a slow erosion. She gathered everything in a dossier that smelled faintly of lemon oil and new paper. It was not a document designed to be dramatic. It was forensic. There were timelines that showed payments matched to events, and emails that showed decisions made in haste. There were records of contracts awarded to friends whose names reappeared like a seam, vendors with no track record, expense accounts that ballooned in hospitality lines, a network mapped across jurisdictions that funneled value and prestige at the expense of long-term solvency. More than facts, it contained the anatomy of choices, the moments when greed displaced caution, the trivial lies that rippled into larger collapses. Watching her family unravel was not pure pleasure. There were nights she stared at the dossier and felt the old hollow ache of abandonment. She had wanted better for herself, not just victory. But she had learned that sometimes the only way to educate the people who hurt you is to let truth have consequences. It was a year into her quiet campaign when she invited them to her new office. The room was light, spare. Furniture chosen for function, not theatrics. She placed the dossier on the table like a mirror. Lucas entered with practiced arrogance. "Allison says you're being dramatic," he said, using the name of a mutual contact as if invoking it were a shield. Margaret's smile was a practiced curve. Her eyes betrayed the calculated recalibration of a woman who had been told public image could obfuscate everything. Amelia spoke softly. "I let the market speak," she said. She slid pages across the table. Contracts signed, due diligence missing, risk reports buried in the month of casual email. She did not raise her voice. She did not point fingers in theatrics. She presented facts, the kind that make a lawyer's hands twitch. The room transformed. Words ran like blood. Faces drained. Lucas tried to joke. Margaret's throat made a sound like a lock resisting a key. "You didn't do this," Lucas accused finally. "You didn't." "I didn't have to," Amelia said. "You did it yourself." There was no dramatic confession. There was only the cold arithmetic of reputations bending under scrutiny. That night, 2 major partners requested independent audits. 1 board member resigned. The cascade began not with a shout, but with a clear accounting. When the first lawsuits emerged, shareholder suits alleging negligence, whistleblowers from within the company, Amelia did what she had planned. She let the legal machine grind. But she did not let it grind without a paddle that steered the current. Her counsel prepared defenses and simultaneously prepared a parallel set of legal tools. Contractual clauses she had inserted months before, a tranche of patents Edward had registered and quietly transferred to her, escrow arrangements that made certain assets legally inaccessible to Hawthorne Industries management. She used corporate governance as a scalpel. If the company tried to divest or move assets, those assets were already framed in legal wrappers she controlled. The law is technical and patient. Its victories are rarely cinematic. Amelia liked it that way. She preferred systems that functioned invisibly, snares cast in footnotes and clauses. When the drama reached courtrooms, she was careful to appear above the fray. Sympathetic, pragmatic, the reasonable scion who cared about stability. Public perception shifted slowly. She was no longer the child who'd left in a storm. She was a steward. The press loved stories of fall, hubris, mistakes, and dramatic reversals. Amelia fed the media clean, verifiable details. Nothing salacious, nothing that could land her in headlines for wrongdoing. She provided timelines and documents to independent journalists who valued scoops but feared litigation. She ensured that what they published was sourced, accurate, and damaging in its quiet precision. When a respected business weekly ran an investigative piece about Hawthorne's pattern of related party transactions and the pattern of questionable vendor selection, the piece did not scream. It whispered. But whispers, she knew, become currents. Clients requested audits, suppliers tightened terms, execs began to whisper to each other about risk. A company built on bravado must respond to the language of proof. When the evidence arrives, bravado dissolves into emergency meetings. Lucas's name, once synonymous with the empire, turned up in paragraphs that explained cascading failures. Board chairs who'd once called him genius now began to say phrases like outdated strategy and lack of oversight. Margaret attempted public damage control, charitable donations and gala appearances, but authenticity can be smelled, and hers always had a faint tang of performance. Amelia did not do this alone. She had allies who'd been slighted by the Hawthorns. A vice president ousted for asking questions, a supplier who'd been pressured into giving discounts, a former Hawthorne executive whose resignation was brushed off. She gathered these people into a network not of revenge junkies but of actors who understood reputational arithmetic. She offered them roles in her new ventures, places where competence was paid for and rewarded. They repaid her with loyalty and information. In boardrooms and backrooms, in messy-tongued break rooms where office gossip bled into board rumors, she learned where the company was vulnerable and how self-preservation could be coaxed into exposing itself. 2 years into her campaign, Hawthorne Industries bled clients. Contracts that once renewed on autopilot required new approvals. A major lender tightened covenants. Lucas tried the old tactics: charisma, confident press conferences, promises of restructuring, but those whose money was on the line wanted sober documentation and independent oversight. Margaret, losing the ability to shape the story, made a crucial misstep. She leaked a private email to a gossip column in an attempt to humanize the family. The email, intended to show affection, instead highlighted the family's tone deafness. Memos about legacy management, juxtaposed with personal pleas for image polishing. The leak proved that private fixes were already being used to paper over structural problems. Amelia watched every misstep catalogued, not rejoicing at human failure, but noting the pattern of how entitlement fails when faced with systemized accountability. The strategic coup came when a consortium of investors approached the company with an offer to provide a lifeline, an acquisition of a subsidiary essential to cash flow. It seemed like salvation for Lucas. It smelled like a rescue mission. Amelia had seeded one of the consortium's lead partners months earlier, a private equity team that wanted stability and transparent governance, not the chaotic nepotism Hawthorne was offering. The consortium required near-immediate governance reforms as a condition: independent directors, audited accounts, and a freeze on insider arrangements. Lucas balked, so did other Hawthorne insiders. But the board, uncomfortable, voted. The lifeline came with scaffolding. The company had to be structurally altered to accept the funds. To the public it looked like rescue. Beneath it was a cleansing. Lucas's circle argued that these conditions were humiliating. To Amelia, they were necessary surgical interventions. The labors of months, building legal wrappings around certain assets and building relationships with institutional investors who preferred rigor, paid off. She did not own the company yet, but she had moved the axis of power. When Hawthorne's auditors published a qualified opinion, the market's reaction was swift. Lenders tightened terms, stock prices slid, and suppliers demanded cash on delivery. Lucas scrambled. His flamboyant risk-taking could not survive the sudden discipline. There were one or two desperate attempts to shift blame, PR campaigns that blamed a coordinated smear. But such campaigns require symmetry. When the facts line up in public documents, they are hard to erode. Board chairs resigned quietly. Executives were encouraged to step down in exchange for severance packages that were themselves scrutinized. By the time Lucas tried to rally support, the architecture for independent oversight had been cemented. Amelia used the independent directors and the hands-on investors to steer restructuring. She did not micromanage. She ensured accountability. The company's momentum shifted away from family myth to sober governance. And under such governance, its existing model often could not survive. 2 weeks after the auditor's opinion, Amelia invited Lucas and Margaret to a public charity gala she had funded in part, an event that, like everything she did, doubled as subtle theater. The ballroom glowed with soft light. She sat between donors whose loyalty was now toward competence. "You built your life on borrowed credibility," she told them quietly at a late hour when guests had dispersed. Margaret's lips trembled. Lucas's hand tightened into a fist. He had been king of an island. Now that the tides had come in, the island looked small and exposed. "You think this proves you're right," he snarled. "You think you can humiliate us in front of everyone?" Amelia was calm. She did not relish humiliation. She wanted restoration of truth and of boundaries. "I think this proves that choices have consequences. I think it proves you preferred spectacle to stewardship. That's not my failing to fix. It's your failure to prevent." She left them with that. She did not gloat. She closed the loop she had opened years before. She had used the mechanisms of power, markets, governance, reputation, to redistribute consequence. Power does not vanish with the fall of a dynasty. It shifts. Amelia could have stripped names from plaques and renamed foundations. Instead, she used the resources she controlled to create institutions her father had never considered. A center for ethical corporate governance, a fund to support workers displaced by Hawthorne's restructuring, scholarships in the sciences and engineering for students from neighborhoods the company had once displaced. Her revenge had been scaled by humanity. That paradox was intentional. She wanted to remove the predator's entitlement but keep the community that had been collateral intact. Mercy in her hands was not soft. It was strategic. It reframed the narrative. She was not just the daughter who returned. She was the steward who had replaced arrogance with obligation. Lucas was left to rebuild. He found a small consultancy role and, eventually, a quieter life. Margaret retreated into social circles that had less clout. They endured public humiliation and private loss. They learned, in slow increments, the bitterness and the pragmatism of consequence. In a small oak cabinet in her office, Amelia kept a bound copy of the dossier, the paper trail that had activated the machine. She had no intention of burning it. She printed a copy, anonymized it, and delivered it to a university business school as a case study. How governance defeats entitlement. Students pored over it, fascinated by the engineering of patience. She never spelled the word revenge to herself in ordinary conversation. She thought of it as rectification, the realignment of incentive and consequence, the restoration of system integrity. At night, she sometimes thought of her young self, the suitcase, the slammed door, and felt both the sting of old wounds and the steadiness of what she had accomplished. Years passed. Hawthorne Industries, under strict governance and an improved operational model, stabilized. It grew more slowly, less ostentatiously, prioritizing durability over headlines. Amelia's portfolio flourished, yes, but so did her projects for public good. The foundation she endowed funded audits in municipal procurement and supported whistleblower protection programs. She established a fellowship for women in corporate law and policy. One autumn evening, she stood on the balcony of her apartment and watched the city lower into dusk. Her phone chimed. An email from a young entrepreneur thanked her for a microgrant that launched a product improving workers' safety in construction, the kind of practical, incremental change she favored. A breeze lifted the edges of the papers on her desk, the dossier now a teaching tool. In the distance, a building where Hawthorne once had boardroom theatrics glowed with new light. She did not raise a glass to victory. She raised it to a different thing. To a system that, when nudged correctly, would mirror truth back to those who had spent a life avoiding it. To patience, she thought, and to the economy of accountability. The city breathed on. Amelia folded her hands and walked inside. A year after she'd set the governance engines in motion, Amelia found herself standing in the dim light of the old Hawthorne chapel. The place smelled faintly of beeswax and cold marble. It had once been ceremonial theater for the family's self-regard. Tonight it was quiet, a neutral room that had long ago stopped being performance space and had quietly become a container for things that needed saying. Lucas had asked for a meeting. He did not come with demands or a swaggering entitlement. He came smaller, wearing the thin armor of someone who had been humbled. He moved like a man trying to learn new steps in a dance he'd abandoned for too long. "I thought about leaving," he said after the silence had been tended like a small garden. "Moving away, starting over. But some things are owed. People. To truth." Amelia watched him. She had no appetite for melodrama now. Years had worn away the hot edges of her anger and left a patient, cooler core. Resentment turned into policy. This wasn't about punishment, Lucas. It was about accountability. You had choices. He let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "You hurt us," he said. "You hurt me. I deserved calling out. Maybe I deserved worse. You deserved to understand the consequences of how you built things," Amelia replied. "So do the people who worked in those buildings, who lost contracts, who had their careers impacted by choices that served image over stewardship." His face folded with something like shame. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Not theatrical. Not a plea for reversal. A small real thing. It landed in the air like a lowered flag. She accepted it without annulling what had happened. Acceptance did not mean reconciliation of the old kind. It meant the end of a particular energy between them. The one that rewarded entitlement. "Apology accepted," she said. "But acceptance isn't an eraser. We both have to live with the outcomes." They walked out of the chapel under a sky scrubbed of stars, neither triumphant nor defeated, just two people recalibrating the weight of their lives. The months after the legal turmoil folded into new governance, Amelia's attention turned to smaller, quieter projects. She created a microgrant program that paid out small, immediate aid to workers laid off during the restructuring. The sums were never headline-making, but they were immediate. Rent covered for a month, a training course paid for, a child's tuition fee. She received letters, handwritten pages of gratitude from people who had been collateral in the collapse of a family myth. One letter arrived from a woman named Rosa, who had worked as a facilities manager at a Hawthorne manufacturing plant. Rosa's handwriting wavered at the margins. She enclosed a photograph of a child wearing a patched coat with a mustard yellow scarf. "Thank you," the note read. "Your grant meant my daughter slept without worry this week. You don't know what that does." Amelia put the letter in a drawer and felt a small, electrical relief that felt nothing like triumph. It was quieter. A sense of restoration made concrete, the kind of fix that did not signal power so much as correct a wrong. She also instituted a fellowship for young compliance officers, people who wanted to learn how to make governance a living practice, not a dusty slide at a conference. They came with idealism and exhaustion in equal measure. She taught them how to read financial statements like stories and how to ask blunt questions without malice. The fellowship built a network of integrity that, in time, began to ripple beyond Hawthorne's immediate orbit. Amelia's dossier remained in the oak cabinet, but it had lost the appetite of weaponry and had become an instrument of pedagogy. A case study, a tool for training, an artifact of what happens when systems are allowed to serve spectacle. At times she still thumbed its edge and felt the old ache, memory's small raggedness. She no longer wanted retribution so much as durable change. On a late winter afternoon, she received an email from a former Hawthorne board member whose life had been upended by the restructuring. He was writing to tell her that he had launched a small non-profit dedicated to accelerating governance literacy in family-run companies. He asked if she would consider speaking at their first symposium. She replied yes. The auditorium was modest but full. Amelia spoke not as an avenger but as a practitioner. She outlined how incentives warp culture, how public accountability can be engineered without vindictiveness, and why compassion must sit next to rigor. She watched faces in the crowd, young lawyers, overworked compliance officers, people who'd once been ready to ignore small failings, for signs that what she'd done could be taught rather than repeated. Afterwards, a young woman approached her, eyes steady. I grew up in a family business, she said. I thought I'd have to choose between love and truth. Your work shows there can be both. Amelia's answer was honest and short. You won't always get it right. But if you teach the next person better, you've done more than I did with a dossier. You made the choice systemic. That's the point. She walked back out into the cold and felt, unexpectedly, less solitary than she had in years. The city carried noise and motion and the steady, indifferent flow of people making lives. Her revenge had been exacting and final, but after it, the work shifted to rebuilding what had been damaged, finally caring for the fragile seams. She paused on the curb, watching a bus take a careful turn. A child looked up and waved at something small and bright inside the bus. A sticker, perhaps, or a balloon. The child's laughter made a tiny sound that was not about victory or loss, but about the ordinary persistence of life. Amelia smiled, a small, settled thing. She turned and walked home,